The little boy's voice barely rose above a whisper, yet every soul inside the crowded church heard it. "Please, don't let them open the old barn." The minister paused in the middle of his prayer. The mourners slowly turned. The boy's pale face showed no fear, only certainty. They buried the truth there. Silence swept through the wooden chapel. Outside, cold Wyoming wind rattled the windows while black clouds rolled across the October sky. No one spoke. No one moved. Then one wealthy rancher quietly stood from the front pew and walked toward a frightened child. Before he could say a single word, a woman stepped between them. Her name was Grace Whitmore. She had arrived in Wyoming only 3 weeks earlier to marry a man she had never met. Instead, she had arrived just in time for his funeral. But before we return to that cold morning, we need to go back 21 days. Because nothing about Daniel Hayes' death was as simple as the town wanted everyone to believe. Boston, Massachusetts, late September, 1876. Grace Whitmore folded Daniel Hayes' latest letter for the 5th time. She had never met the Wyoming rancher in person. Their entire relationship existed through ink, paper, and patience. Unlike many men who advertised through matrimonial agencies, Daniel never wrote about loneliness. He never tried to sound charming. Instead, he described weather, fence repairs, horse breeding, the condition of the river after heavy rain, how many calves survived each winter, how the prairie changed colors before sunrise. Grace admired that. People who exaggerated usually hid something. People who described ordinary things often had nothing to hide. She had spent 7 years working as a schoolteacher. Children had taught her an important lesson. Truth rarely shouted. It whispered. Daniel's final letter had arrived 10 days earlier. He apologized because he couldn't meet her stagecoach personally. A cattle inspection required him to travel 2 days east before her arrival. He promised his foreman would welcome her instead. At the bottom of the letter, he added something strange. If anything feels wrong after you arrive, trust Noah before you trust anyone else. Nothing more. No explanation. Only one sentence. Grace read it several times. Who was Noah? Daniel had mentioned his son only once in all their letters. 8 years old. Quiet. Fond of horses. Still grieving his mother's death 4 years earlier. Grace folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her leather journal. She had no idea those would be the last words Daniel Hayes would ever write. The stagecoach reached Red Creek, Wyoming, just before sunset. Dust floated across the empty streets. The town was smaller than Grace expected. A blacksmith, a church, a general store, one hotel, one sheriff's office, and dozens of horses tied outside wooden buildings weathered by years of prairie wind. Grace stepped down carrying one carpet bag and one wooden trunk. She searched every face. None matched Daniel's description. Instead, an elderly man with silver hair approached. "You must be Miss Whitmore." "I am. My name's Samuel Briggs." The foreman, the old man, lowered his eyes. "I wish that were the hardest thing I had to tell you." Grace felt the world become strangely quiet. Daniel Hayes passed away 4 days ago. The words landed gently, almost too gently. Sometimes terrible news arrives without sound. Only after several moments does the heart understand what the ears have already heard. Grace looked toward the endless Wyoming plains. Everything remained exactly the same. The horses still breathed. The wind still moved. The sun continued setting. Only her future had disappeared. "I'm sorry," Samuel said softly. "There was an accident." "What kind?" He fell from his horse. Grace nodded politely, not because she believed him, because she noticed what he did not say. He never looked her in the eye while explaining it. Teachers notice small things. Children lie with their mouths. Adults lie with their eyes. Samuel's eyes remained fixed on the ground. The Hayes Ranch stood nearly 4 miles north of town. Wide grassland stretched endlessly beneath an orange evening sky. The ranch house itself was sturdy. Large porch, white fencing, fresh repairs along the western stable. Someone had taken good care of the property, yet something felt absent. No laughter, no workers talking, no dogs running freely. It felt like a house waiting for permission to breathe again. The front door opened before Grace reached the steps. A young boy stood there, thin, freckles across his cheeks, dark brown hair, serious gray eyes far older than 8 years should possess. "You came." Grace smiled gently. "You must be Noah." He nodded. "My father said you would." He studied her for several long seconds, then quietly asked, "Did he send another letter before he died?" Grace shook her head. "No." The boy looked disappointed. "As I thought." No tears, no childish questions, only disappointment. That struck Grace harder than grief itself. Children usually cried. Children expected miracles. This boy expected answers. Dinner passed almost entirely in silence. Samuel ate little. The elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Parker, avoided every difficult subject. Noah barely touched his food. Grace finally asked a question everyone else seemed determined to avoid. Where exactly did the accident happen? Samuel stopped chewing. Northridge. Anyone see it? No. Who found him? Another pause. I did. What time? Near sunset. What happened to the horse? Samuel slowly placed down his fork. It ran off. Grace nodded. Again, the answers were complete, yet somehow unfinished. She had spent years correcting essays. Sometimes students answered every question while avoiding the truth entirely. Samuel reminded her of those students. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. Wyoming nights sounded different from Boston. No wagon wheels, no city voices, only wind. Coyotes somewhere far away, with creaking inside old walls. Near midnight, another sound appeared. Footsteps, very careful footsteps. Grace quietly lit a lamp. She opened her bedroom door, just enough to look into the hallway. No one. Then she noticed movement outside. Someone carrying a lantern crossed the yard, heading toward an old wooden barn standing alone beyond the corrals. The lantern disappeared inside. Grace waited. 10 minutes. 20. No one came back out. The light simply vanished, as though swallowed by darkness itself. The next morning, Noah found her staring toward that distant barn. You saw it too. Grace looked at him. The lantern? He nodded. It comes every few nights. Who carries it? I've never seen. You never followed? I did once. His voice became almost inaudible. My father got very angry. He told me never to go near that barn again. Why? Noah hesitated, then whispered, because someone wanted what's buried underneath. Grace frowned. Buried? The boy immediately looked toward the house. Mrs. Parker had stepped onto the porch. Conversation ended. Later that afternoon, Grace asked Samuel about the old barn. It's unsafe. When was it last used? Years ago. For what? Storage. What kind? Old equipment. Grace smiled politely. And why does someone carry a lantern there at midnight? Samuel's weathered face tightened for only a second. I think you've mistaken coyotes for people. Grace had expected denial. She had not expected fear. For the first time since arriving, Samuel appeared genuinely nervous. Not angry, not defensive, afraid. The town held Daniel Hayes' memorial service 3 days later. Nearly everyone attended. Farmers, merchants, cowboys, even people who admitted they barely knew him. Grace watched carefully. Funerals often revealed more about the living than the dead. One man stood apart from everyone else. Expensive black coat, silver pocket watch, perfectly polished boots untouched by dust. His confidence filled every corner of the church. Someone whispered his name. Victor Kane, the wealthiest cattle owner in 3 counties. After the service, he approached Grace with a warm smile that somehow never reached his eyes. Miss Whitmore, I'm terribly sorry for your loss. Thank you. I understand Daniel intended to marry you. Yes. A tragic misunderstanding of timing. He glanced toward the ranch visible beyond the hills. The Hayes property is difficult for a woman alone. I've managed difficult things before, I'm sure. His smile widened. If you ever decide to sell, my office can prepare fair papers immediately. Grace looked directly into his eyes. I only arrived 3 days ago. Exactly. Which makes this the easiest time to leave. He tipped his hat politely and walked away. Grace watched him disappear into crowd. She had taught hundreds of children. She had met proud parents, strict principals, dishonest merchants, kind strangers. Victor Kane reminded her of none of them. He reminded her of a man who had already decided how another person's story should end. He simply expected everyone else to agree. That evening, as the church slowly emptied, Noah quietly slipped his small hand into Grace's. Without looking at her, he whispered the same words that would later stop an entire funeral. Don't trust Mr. Kane. Grace looked down. Why? The boys stared toward the distant hills where the lonely barn stood against the fading sunset. Because Father said, if anything ever happened to him, the truth would still be waiting there. He pointed toward the old barn. And now, they know someone else is looking for it. Grace barely slept that night. The words Noah had whispered continued circling through her mind. The truth would still be waiting there. People often protected money. Sometimes they protected land. But only fear made grown men protect an abandoned barn. The next morning the ranch appeared perfectly ordinary. Cowboys repaired fencing. Mrs. Parker baked bread. Samuel inspected horses. Yet every pair of eyes quietly drifted toward Grace whenever she stepped outside, as if everyone expected her to make a decision she did not yet understand herself. She spent the morning walking through Daniel Hayes' study. Unlike the rest of the house, nothing inside the room had been disturbed. Maps covered one wall. Receipts lay stacked neatly on the desk. Every ledger was organized with remarkable precision. Daniel had been a careful man, very careful. Grace opened each account book one page at a time. Income, expenses, livestock purchases, feed costs, everything balanced almost perfectly. Almost. Near the back of the final ledger, one line caught her attention. Every month, exactly $50 had been withdrawn. No explanation, no signature, no destination, just one letter. B. The payment appeared every single month for nearly 3 years. Grace counted 36 entries, exactly the same amount, exactly 30 days apart. People rarely repeated mistakes. Patterns usually belonged to purpose. She copied every entry into her journal. That afternoon, Noah quietly entered the study. My father kept another book. Grace looked up. Where? He never kept it inside the house. Why not? He said houses burn. The answer sounded strange coming from an 8-year-old. He said truth should never sleep under the same roof as lies. Grace slowly closed the ledger. Can you show me? Noah hesitated. If Samuel doesn't see us. They crossed a pasture just before sunset. The abandoned barn stood nearly half a mile from the main house. Its roof sagged. The western wall leaned slightly inward. Most people would have believed it had been empty for years. Grace immediately noticed something different. Fresh horse tracks. Someone had visited recently. Very recently. Noah pointed toward the back entrance. My father never used the front. The rear door opened with almost no sound. Dust floated through thin beams of fading sunlight. Broken wagons rested against one wall. Old harnesses hung from rusted hooks. Everything appeared abandoned, until Grace noticed the floor. One section of wooden planks looked newer than the rest. She knelt beside it. The nails showed almost no rust. Someone had removed those boards before, many times. Grace carefully lifted the first plank, then the second. Below them rested a small iron box wrapped in side-worn canvas. Noah's breathing quickened. My father hid it there. Grace pulled the box into the light. The lock had already been broken. Someone had opened it years earlier. Inside rested several folded documents, a leather notebook, and one sealed envelope. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were 5 simple words. For Grace Whitmore alone. Her heart stopped. Daniel had prepared this long before she arrived. She carefully broke the seal. The letter read, "Grace, if this letter reaches you, then I was right to be afraid. Someone close to this ranch has spent years stealing land from families across this valley. Not with guns, with signatures. I finally found proof. If anything happens to me, trust Noah. Trust no one who asks you to sell." The notebook explains everything. Finish what I could not. Daniel Hayes. Grace slowly lowered the letter. Daniel had known. He had expected danger. And somehow, he had expected her. The leather notebook contained names. 23 of them. Beside every name appeared dates, property descriptions, loan agreements, and one repeated signature. Victor Kane. Grace turned another page. Another signature. Another family losing land. Another suspicious death. Another ranch changing ownership only weeks later. The pattern stretched back 15 years. Some ranchers disappeared. Others died unexpectedly. Widows signed papers they barely understood. Children inherited nothing. Victor Kane inherited everything. Grace realized why Daniel had been killed. He had stopped seeing separate tragedies. He had started seeing a system. A sudden noise echoed outside. Horse hooves. Several riders. Grace immediately extinguished the lantern. Voices drifted through broken walls. "They've been here. Spread out. Search everything." Grace grabbed Noah's hand. The boy remained perfectly calm. He pointed toward a narrow opening beneath loose hay. "My father showed me." They crawled underneath just as the barn door burst open. Heavy boots crossed the wooden floor. Someone overturned barrels. Another man kicked broken furniture aside. Grace held Noah close while dust drifted into the hiding place. Then she heard a familiar voice. "Victor Kane, I know Hayes hid something here. Keep looking. If the woman finds it first." He never finished the sentence. Silence answered him. After nearly 20 minutes, the riders finally left. Only when every hoofbeat disappeared into the distance did Grace breathe normally again. They returned to the ranch lawn after dark. Mrs. Parker met them at the kitchen door. "You must leave." Grace frowned. "What happened?" "Victor Kane was here. He says you're signing sale papers tomorrow." "I never agreed." Mrs. Parker's tired eyes filled with worry. "He doesn't care." Samuel stepped into the room. For the first time since Grace had arrived, the old foreman looked directly at her. "I owe you the truth." Grace remained silent. Samuel slowly removed his hat. "I lied about Daniel's death." The room became perfectly still. He didn't fall from his horse. Grace's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Tell me everything." Samuel swallowed hard. Daniel found proof against Victor. He planned to ride to Cheyenne and meet a federal marshal. The night before he left, someone ambushed him near the river. Samuel closed his eyes. "I reached him before sunrise. He was still alive." Grace felt every word like another stone. "He gave me one job. Protect Noah and wait for you." Grace stared at him. "He knew I was coming?" Samuel nodded slowly. He said, "Grace sees what other people ignore. She'll finish this." The following morning, Victor Kane arrived exactly as promised. A polished wagon stopped outside the ranch house. 2 lawyers stepped down beside him. So did 4 armed ranch hands. Victor smiled pleasantly. "I brought the ownership papers." Grace looked at the documents, then folded them without reading. "I won't be signing." Victor's smile faded only slightly. "You should reconsider." "I already have. This ranch belongs to Noah." Victor stepped closer. "Legally," Grace interrupted calmly. "I've read the law. So have these." She placed Daniel's notebook onto the table. Every color disappeared from Victor Kane's face. For the first time, the powerful cattle baron looked frightened. You stole 23 ranches. You forged signatures. You arranged fraudulent loans. And Daniel kept records of everyone. Victor's voice hardened. No court will believe a schoolteacher. Grace smiled for the first time since arriving in Wyoming. I wasn't collecting opinions. I was collecting evidence. At that exact moment, horses thundered into the ranch yard. Dozens of them. Samuel looked through the window. They're here. The front door opened. Sheriff Thomas Reed entered first. Behind him stood 2 federal marshals from Cheyenne. One carried an arrest warrant. The other already held iron handcuffs. Victor slowly turned toward Grace. You planned this? Grace shook her head. No, Daniel did. I simply finished what he started. The marshals stepped forward. Victor Kane made no attempt to run. Some men realized a moment they had finally lost. This was his. 3 weeks later, the valley looked different. Not because the land had changed, because the truth had. Families once driven away began returning. Stolen ranches were restored through federal court orders. Old deeds replaced forged ones. Samuel continued managing the Hayes Ranch. Mrs. Parker finally laughed again. Noah smiled more often than he spoke. One cool autumn evening, Grace stood beside Daniel's grave. She placed a single wildflower beneath the simple wooden cross. I never became your wife, she whispered, but I kept my promise. Behind her, Noah quietly waited. When she turned around, the boy held out Daniel's old ranch keys. They're yours now. Grace looked across the endless Wyoming prairie. Golden grass danced beneath the evening wind. The fences Daniel had repaired still stood. The horses still ran freely. The house no longer felt empty. It felt like home. She accepted the keys, not as an inheritance, as a responsibility. Together, she and Noah walked back toward the ranch, where the porch light glowed warmly against the coming night. Some stories end with revenge. Others end with justice. Daniel Hayes' story ended with something even rarer. The truth survived because one honest man had trusted the right person before it was too late. And sometimes that is enough to change an entire frontier forever.